Hi, my name is Madeline McDonald. I am a master's candidate for the Education of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing program. I did my non-thesis research project on the self-esteem levels of adults with late identified hearing loss. I chose this topic because I am a individual with late identified hearing loss, and I wanted to know more information about how late identification can impact beyond childhood. There's a lot of information out there about the effect of late identification and lack of access to early intervention leading to language deprivation, but there's not any information about how this impacts into adulthood and how this impacts self-esteem levels. So beyond that, once I had picked my topic, I decided to look into self-esteem theories and found the sociometer theory by Mark Leary that states that self-esteem is based solely on an individual's perception of how others believe them or how others accept them. So it does not mean that an individual has to be physically excluded. As long as they feel that they are being excluded, they will have a lower self-esteem. And I think this relates perfectly to individuals with hearing loss, just because there's a lot of trouble with communication and having access that an individual might feel they are being excluded without others actually physically excluding them. And so I proposed a hypothesis that individuals who are late identified with hearing loss would have a lower self-esteem. Once I had decided on my topic, I went ahead and created a 13-question survey, and I was approved by the IRB. Of those 13 questions, 11 were demographic questions asking about age, gender, the type of hearing loss, configuration, and I learned just from those 11 questions that um, the majority of participants are not familiar with their hearing loss. Those that are unidentified, they answered a lot of questions with an unknown or I do not know. They don't know the type of hearing loss they have, what type or what their hearing loss looks like, what sounds they have access to. There's a lot of unknowns in regards to hearing loss when it comes to late identified individuals. Another thing I had found from my survey is that the majority of my participants were in fact female. Drawing conclusions for in this study was extremely difficult because I had a very small sample size. 21 people agreed to the informed consent. However, only 3 people finished the entire survey. Um, then moving on from that, my second research question was what are the perceptions of adults who are late identified with hearing loss in relation to self-esteem? I had 2 questions related directly to that research question. The first one was an open-ended question asking participants how they feel that late identification has impacted their self-esteem. And I do have some participant quotes at the bottom of my poster, but the theme coming from that question was the majority of participants, all of them feel that hearing loss has impacted their ability to communicate. They are late identified individuals, which means they did not have access to early intervention services, and that could in turn lead to language deprivation and many other problems that come along with not having access to early intervention. And one of the biggest things is that there is a common communication breakdown among individuals who are late identified. And so that in turn could lower self-esteem because they are not feeling that they are being accepted and they're not able to communicate with others and either in the hearing world through English or in deaf culture through ASL because they did not have access to learn that either. And then my last question was the Rosenberg self-esteem score, scale score, and I had 3 individuals complete that last question, and it did tie right back to my hypothesis, and that yes, it does seem that individuals who were late identified as a child who had hearing loss that occurred as a child who would have all of those impacts of language deprivation and no access to early intervention did indeed have the lowest self-esteem score, whereas others who are older do have higher self-esteem.